He was 23 years old, and he smelled like a horse. That's not a metaphor, that's not colorful language meant to set a scene. George Armstrong Custer, the youngest general in the history of the United States Army at that point, genuinely could not be separated from his animals long enough to wash properly. He slept near them. He ate near them. He rode them until they were lathered white, and then he rode them some more. His staff officers, men who respected him, feared him, and occasionally wanted to strangle him, wrote home about the experience of sharing close quarters with a man who treated personal hygiene as something that happened to other people when they weren't busy winning a war. This is the part of Custer's story that nobody really wants to sit with because it complicates the portrait. The golden-haired cavalier charging into rebel lines with his saber raised and his red scarf streaming behind him, that image is too clean, too cinematic. The real thing was messier. The real thing was a young man from Ohio who hadn't figured out how to reconcile his enormous ambitions with his very limited patience for the quieter obligations of command. He was eating salt pork with his fingers one morning and dictating orders to his adjutant at the same time, and nobody thought to write that down because it wasn't the kind of thing you wrote down. It was just Tuesday. The Civil War cavalry camp where Custer spent his days during the campaigns of 1863 and 1864 was not the romantic tableau that later paintings would suggest. It was noise and rot and improvisation. A camp housing several thousand men and their horses produced a smell that could be detected from a considerable distance downwind, and that was before you factored in the latrines, the cooking fires, the unwashed clothing, the occasional dead animal that hadn't been properly disposed of. Custer moved through this environment with what his subordinates described as a kind of manic energy. Not the focused, deliberate energy of a man working through a problem, but the restless, crackling energy of someone who could not stand still long enough for the world to catch up with him. He was up before most of his men. This was consistent throughout his military career, both in the Civil War and later on the plains. It wasn't discipline that got him out of his blankets before dawn. It was something closer to an inability to stop thinking long enough to sleep deeply. His wife, Libbie, whom he called Libbie and wrote to with an obsessive frequency that bordered on the compulsive, described him as a man who woke up already in the middle of a thought. He would surface from sleep talking, sometimes mid-sentence, often about whatever tactical problem had been rolling through his mind in the dark hours. His aides learned to keep paper nearby. The letters themselves are one of the stranger artifacts of Custer's inner life. He wrote to Libbie constantly, sometimes multiple letters in a single day when campaigning allowed for it, sometimes scrawling notes by firelight after midnight when he should have been sleeping. The letters are not the careful, composed communications of a man thinking about posterity. They're raw and sometimes embarrassing, full of pet names and domestic longing, and breathless accounts of combat that slide without warning into requests for specific items, better coffee, a particular kind of tobacco, news about the dog. He wrote once about missing the sound of rain on a roof so intensely that he had to put the letter down and walk outside. Then he came back and finished it. His relationship with food in the field was chaotic. He wasn't particularly interested in eating, which made him unusual among his peers. Most officers, when deprived of regular meals by the demands of campaigning, became almost fanatical about food whenever it was available. Custer ate to function. He was known to skip meals entirely when something more interesting was happening, which, in his world, was most of the time. His cook, a freed black man named Eliza, who traveled with his headquarters for much of the war and whose actual last name most historical accounts do not bother to record, reportedly developed something like exasperated maternal authority over Custer's eating habits. She would physically put food in front of him and stand there until he acknowledged it. He would eat it standing up, reading dispatches, barely tasting it. The coffee was different. The coffee he cared about. A bad cup of coffee was one of the few things that could genuinely irritate him in the mornings, and the quality of the brew at any given camp was a legitimate topic of conversation among people who wanted to predict what kind of mood the general was going to be in. This is the kind of detail that sounds invented, but is corroborated by enough sources to be believed. The man who rode headlong into Confederate artillery fire had strong feelings about his morning coffee. History is always like this, the enormous and the trivial sitting right next to each other, sharing the same table. His uniform was a different matter entirely, and it gets at something real about who Custer was beneath the theatrics. He designed his own. That sentence needs to sit for a moment. While other officers wore the standard blue of the Union Army, Custer appeared on the battlefield in a black velvet jacket, gold piping, a scarlet necktie, and boots that came up to his knee. He wore a wide-brimmed hat tilted at an angle that communicated something between cavalry swagger and deliberate provocation. The whole effect was calculated. He knew exactly what he was doing. He understood intuitively and before most people of his generation that command was partly performance, that soldiers fight harder for leaders they can see and recognize and believe in, and that a general who looked like every other general was a general his men might hesitate for a fraction of a second before following. That fraction of a second could be the difference between a charge that broke the Confederate line and one that got absorbed and swallowed. But the uniform served another purpose too, one that Custer might not have been fully conscious of. It made him a target. In a war where generals were not immune to bullets, a fact that killed several of his contemporaries, Custer's decision to dress like something out of a stage production was functionally insane. The Confederate sharpshooters who saw that black velvet and gold braid through their rifle sights knew exactly who they were looking at. He was shot at constantly. He had horses killed under him with a frequency that eventually became almost statistical. By the end of the war, he had lost 11 horses in combat. 11. Each time, he found another one and kept going. The horses were not incidental to his daily life. They were central to it in a way that went beyond the practical requirements of cavalry command. Custer had a relationship with horses that his men found both admirable and slightly unnerving. He could read an animal's temperament within minutes of being introduced to it. He knew how to push a horse to the edge of its endurance without crossing into the territory where the animal simply stopped functioning. This was a skill developed through years of riding in Ohio and honed through the brutal education of campaigning, and it gave him a significant advantage in the fluid, fast-moving warfare of Civil War cavalry operations. A general who understood horses could make decisions that a general who merely rode them could not. He named them. This was not unusual for cavalry officers, but Custer's attachment was more intense than average. When a horse was killed under him in battle, there are accounts of him pausing, sometimes in the middle of ongoing combat, sometimes immediately afterward to acknowledge what had happened. Not grieving exactly, something more compressed than grief. A recognition, and then forward motion. His staff had a complicated relationship with him that no single word adequately describes. They were loyal, most of them, with the particular loyalty that forms between men who have survived dangerous things together. But Custer was not an easy man to serve. He was demanding in ways that seemed unreasonable until the moment they suddenly seemed necessary. He expected the same reckless commitment to the mission that he himself provided, and he had limited tolerance for the men who couldn't match it. His temper was quick and hot and usually short. He would erupt, make his position unmistakably clear, and then move on without apparent residue of the conflict. The people around him did not always find it so easy to move on. He was also capable of extraordinary personal loyalty. Officers he respected, he protected with a tenacity that went beyond the requirements of command. When his men were shortchanged on rations or equipment, something that happened with depressing regularity in the Union Army's tangled supply system, Custer would argue, cajole, threaten, and occasionally steal on their behalf. He once requisitioned horses that had been allocated to another unit because he judged his own men's need to be greater. The paperwork that followed was extensive and uncomfortable. He didn't care. The horses were useful, the paperwork was not. The rhythm of a day in camp when they were not actively campaigning had a structure that Custer disrupted as often as he followed. The standard schedule called for reveille, morning inspection, drill, meals at specified times, officers' call in the evenings. Custer observed the parts he found useful and quietly subverted the rest. Drill he took seriously enough that his brigade had a reputation for combat effectiveness that was partly a product of relentless practice, men rehearsing the movements of mounted warfare until they became reflexive. But the formalities of camp social life, the evening calls, the careful observance of rank and protocol, these he dispensed with when other things demanded his attention, and other things almost always demanded his attention. He read. This is another detail that tends to get lost in the portrait of Custer as pure action. He was an intelligent man with real intellectual curiosity, particularly about the campaigns he was participating in. He studied the movements of both armies with an analytical attention that his reputation for impulsiveness might not suggest. He also read newspapers obsessively, which was a habit and a professional necessity in a war where the press had genuine power to shape how officers were perceived. Custer understood the press with an instinct that was ahead of his time. He cultivated correspondence. He gave good quotes. He made sure that when his brigade did something worth noting, someone was around to note it. This was not vanity, or not only vanity, it was strategy. He had watched enough of the war by the summer of 1863 to understand that military careers in this conflict were not built solely on battlefield performance. They were built on perception, on the stories that circulated in Washington and in the newspapers that Washington read. A general who won battles without publicity was at the mercy of men who won smaller battles with better press. Custer was not going to be at the mercy of anyone if he could help it. The nights were harder than the days to manage. Days had movement, problems, decisions, the particular anesthesia of constant activity. Nights, especially the long nights before a major engagement, stripped all of that away. Custer's letters to Libbie suggest a man who was more frightened than he let anyone see. Not of death exactly, but of something vaguer and harder to name, of failing, of the gap between what he presented to the world and what he privately suspected about himself. He writes once about lying awake listening to his men sleep in the camp around him and feeling for a moment the full weight of being responsible for those lives. Then, he writes, he stopped feeling it because he had to. The morning of a battle had its own particular quality, different from any other morning. Custer's behavior in those hours is documented by enough first-hand accounts to draw a reliable picture. He became quieter, not subdued, but concentrated. The manic perigee pulled inward. He ate nothing, or almost nothing. He checked his weapons personally, a habit some of his staff found redundant given how many orderlies and aides were available for exactly that purpose. He visited his horses. He talked to the men, not the officers, the enlisted men, the privates and corporals and sergeants who were going to be at the front of whatever was about to happen. He learned their names with an earnestness that occasionally made them uncomfortable. These were not the actions of a man performing for an audience. The audience would come later. When the order came to move, something shifted in him that the people around him found difficult to describe without resorting to words like transformed or electric. The quietness burned off. He was at the front before anyone expected him to be, riding hard, the red scarf catching behind him, shouting encouragement in a voice that carried over the noise of thousands of moving men and animals. His aide, Henry Kidd, wrote about watching Custer lead a charge at Hanover in the summer of 1863 and being unable to account for why several hundred men were following someone who was doing something objectively suicidal at what could only be described as an enthusiastic gallop. The answer, Kidd concluded eventually, was that Custer made it seem like the natural thing to do. Like the alternative, stopping, considering, calculating the odds, was the strange and irrational choice. Between engagements, the boredom was its own kind of problem. Armies in the Civil War spent far more time waiting than fighting, and the waiting was its own form of attrition, on morale, on discipline, on men's mental states. Custer dealt with boredom aggressively. He organized races, both horse races and foot races, and bet on them with an enthusiasm that occasionally created diplomatic complications with officers from neighboring units. He set up targets and held shooting competitions. He played cards. He played with his dogs. He traveled with several of them throughout the war, acquiring and losing them in patterns that roughly mirrored the campaign's movements. The dogs deserve their own paragraph because they tell you something important about who he was when the performance was turned off. Custer's dogs were, by the accounts of everyone who observed them, completely undisciplined, wildly affectionate, and treated by their owner with a consistency and patience that was not always on display in his professional relationships. He talked to them, he let them sleep where they wanted. He grieved genuinely when one was lost, which happened more often than one would hope in the vicinity of an active war. The dogs had no utility in the conventional sense. They didn't help him win battles or build his reputation or manage his command, but he kept acquiring them anyway. That tells you something. His physical condition through the major campaigns of 1863 and 1864 was, by most contemporary accounts, remarkable. He was young and constitutionally suited to the demands of mounted warfare, the long hours in the saddle, the cold nights, the irregular nutrition, the accumulated stress of command. He didn't get sick the way many of his contemporaries did. The dysentery and typhoid that moved through Civil War camps like slow democratic catastrophes left him largely untouched. He credited this to his horses, which he may have meant as a joke and may not have. Being in the saddle meant being off the ground, and being off the ground meant less direct exposure to the contaminated soil and water that were killing soldiers at a rate that rivaled combat. But the physical toll was real even when it wasn't visible. His hands by his mid-20s were permanently calloused from rains. His back troubled him in later life in ways that almost certainly traced back to years of extended cavalry operations. He slept badly when he slept at all. He aged, as men who fight wars age, not evenly, not gradually, but in sudden increments, so that photographs taken a year apart sometimes look like they're separated by a decade. What's harder to measure, and what the photographs don't show at all, is what all of it was doing to him internally. The war that made George Armstrong Custer famous also created in him a set of expectations about himself, about what he was capable of, about what risk was acceptable, about the relationship between audacity and outcome actually looked like, that would follow him for the rest of his life, and eventually, on a hillside in Montana in June of 1876, contribute to the deaths of him and more than 200 of his men. He had learned in the crucible of Civil War cavalry command that the aggressive move was usually the right move, that hesitation cost more than recklessness, that the officer who committed fully, who went in without reservation, who made the enemy believe in the absolute sincerity of the attack, that officer won more often than he lost. This was true. It was also, like most truths, incomplete in ways that would only become clear under specific conditions that the Civil War had never quite provided. In the last weeks of the war, when it was obvious even to the Confederate commanders in the field that the thing was coming to an end, Custer was everywhere. He had that quality of men who cannot release a thing even after the essential question has been settled. He fought the final engagements of the Appomattox campaign with the same intensity he had brought to Gettysburg and Yellow Tavern, as if the war's momentum was something he personally had to keep driving until it came to a full stop. He was present at the Appomattox courthouse when Lee surrendered. Philip Sheridan, his commanding general, and the man who understood him better than almost anyone else, purchased the table on which the surrender terms were written and gave it to Libbie Custer with a note calling her husband the best cavalry commander America had ever produced. The man who emerged from the Civil War was not the boy who entered it, though the surface features remained the same. The long hair, now a signature rather than a style choice, the theatrical flair, the physical recklessness. Something underneath had changed in the way that years of making life and death decisions always change people. He was harder in ways he probably wasn't aware of, more certain of his own judgment in ways that made him less able to reckon honestly with its limits. The war had given him an education in his own best qualities, the courage, the tactical instinct, the ability to inspire men in terrible circumstances, without giving him much opportunity to learn his weaknesses. His daily life on the frontier, in the years between Appomattox and the Little Bighorn, had echoes of the pattern he had established in the war. The same early mornings, the same letters to Libbie, still flowing in the same unguarded rush that had characterized his wartime correspondence. The same dogs, the same difficult relationship with boredom, the same conviction settled deep in him by now like something geological, that the difference between victory and defeat was mostly a matter of will, that if you went hard enough, fast enough, and with enough of yourself fully committed to the outcome would cooperate. It's tempting, in retrospect, to read his story as a tragedy in the classical sense, a man brought down by the very qualities that made him extraordinary. The courage that looked like recklessness, the confidence that looked like arrogance, the inability to slow down that kept getting confused in others' accounts, and perhaps in his own, with the inability to be afraid. But tragedy in the classical sense requires a kind of self-knowledge that Custer may not have possessed in the necessary quantity, a moment of recognition where the protagonist understands what has happened and why. What we have instead is something more common and in some ways more interesting. A man who was genuinely extraordinarily good at a particular thing in a particular time and place, and who spent the rest of his life in a world that kept presenting him with situations that looked like that thing but weren't quite. A cavalry charge and a campaign against people defending their homeland are not the same problem, even when you're on horseback for both. The muscles you build fighting one kind of war do not automatically transfer to another kind. Custer never fully learned this, or never fully believed it, which may amount to the same thing. But in those years in the middle of the Civil War, when the Michigan Brigade followed him into Confederate lines at a dead run and somehow came out the other side intact, in those particular years, in that particular chaos, he was something genuinely rare. Not a hero in the simple sense that gets stamped on monuments and painted in murals, but something more complicated and therefore more human. A young man who was perfectly, terrifyingly suited to a terrible situation, who could eat standing up and smell like a horse and write love letters by firelight and then ride the next morning into something that should have killed him and somehow not get killed. The coffee had to be good though, he was clear about that. Some things were non-negotiable.